In the quiet hours of an ordinary morning, before the first messages arrive and the world makes its usual claims on your attention, there is a moment when you are alone with your body. Feeling perhaps the slight weight of your heartbeat in your chest, the stretch of your muscles, the small signals that usually pass like soft weather through your awareness. And it is here in this understated, familiar intimacy that a new idea in medicine begins to find its place. The notion that somewhere, invisibly and yet with exquisite detail, a second version of you could be listening to every one of those signals as well. Before we move on, if you like learning this way, you can quietly hit subscribe so you don't lose this channel later. Not a clone or a fantasy, but a mathematically and biologically grounded counterpart that exists as patterns in computers and models in virtual space. An echo of your physiology that is patient, tireless, and designed to understand. This is the emerging world of the digital twin in medicine, a field that has taken shape in engineering and aerospace. Where virtual replicas of jet engines or wind farms or spacecraft let experts explore stresses, failures, and possibilities before metal is ever stressed or fuel is ever burned. And is now turning its attention, with a peculiar blend of humility and ambition, to the human body itself. For decades, physicians have worked with abstractions, averages, population risk scores, generalized guidelines that smooth away the unruly variety of individual lives. But the digital twin promises something more intimate and demanding, a model built not around an anonymous typical patient, but around you. With your genome, your heart rhythm, your history of sleep and stress, your patterns of movement and rest, your particular vulnerabilities. It is a concept that asks us to imagine medicine not as a series of reactions to crises, but as a continuous conversation between the physical person and their virtual counterpart. A conversation in which predictions are made quietly, far in advance, and warnings are delivered while there is still time to alter course in gentle ways rather than with drastic interventions. Already, pieces of this vision exist in specialized settings. Cardiologists use computational models of blood flow to decide how to open narrowed arteries. Neurosurgeons plan delicate operations on three-dimensional reconstructions of brain tissue. And intensive care units rely on streams of data to approximate how a critically ill patient might respond to different choices. But these pieces are fragmented, each focused on a particular organ or moment. What the idea of a true digital twin proposes is continuity and coherence, a medical avatar that does not disappear when discharge papers are signed but persists. Evolving alongside you over months and years, growing more precise as it accumulates more data, like a story that refines itself with every new chapter. This virtual self would not be a glossy, gamified character with exaggerated features. Instead, it would be something quieter and more profound, an internal mirror composed of sensor readings, imaging scans, molecular profiles, and the statistical fingerprints of your behavior. All bound together by algorithms that seek patterns too subtle for human observers to catch. Underneath this promise lies a shift in philosophy as much as in technology, a move from seeing disease as a sudden enemy to be confronted in battle, toward recognizing illness as the visible surface of processes that have been playing out in silence for years. Processes that might be gently nudged in healthier directions if they were seen early enough and understood clearly enough. When researchers at institutions like the European Commission's Virtual Physiological Human Initiative, or projects funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health speak about digital twins, they talk about flows of blood and electrical impulses, about gene expression and immune responses, but they also talk about time, about turning the unpredictable future into a landscape that can be surveyed from many angles before one decides which path to walk. To imagine your own digital twin is to picture a model that not only knows your current lab results and diagnoses, but that can simulate how your arterial walls might stiffen if certain habits continue, how your blood sugar might drift upward in the presence of particular stresses. how your risk of arrhythmia might shift if a new medication is added or discontinued, not as vague probabilities, but as concrete trajectories unique to you. In that sense, the digital twin is not a static portrait, but a living hypothesis about your body, continuously tested against reality as new measurements arrive. When your smartwatch registers a week of poor sleep, when your phone notes diminished steps, when a periodic blood test shows a slight change in lipid levels. All of these become small corrections to the simulations running quietly in the background, nudging the algorithms to refine their understanding of who you are at the level of biology. It is tempting, especially in an age of vivid science fiction and animated interfaces, to imagine this twin as something dramatically visible, perhaps displayed on a screen rotating in anatomically perfect detail. But the more transformative reality will be less theatrical and more akin to a new sense organ for clinicians and patients. A way to see across time and scale, from molecular events to organ-level behavior, from daily routines to long-term risk, in a single integrated framework. Already, platforms like Dassault Systems' Living Heart project offer a glimpse of how this might feel in practice, with virtual hearts that beat according to an individual's anatomical and electrical data. Letting cardiologists test how an implanted device or a structural repair might alter the dance of contraction and relaxation long before the real heart is touched by a scalpel or catheter. These early exemplars suggest that the boundary between imagination and clinic is thinning. Computer scientists, biomedical engineers, and physicians now sit together at workstations where human tissue is rendered into meshes and equations. Parameters drawn from MRI scans and CT images are fed into finite element models, and the resulting simulations are compared back against real patients' outcomes to see how faithfully the digital twin behaved. Under the soft glow of these monitors, what used to be intuition, how will this patient respond, what if we try this instead, becomes something that can be explored safely in silico. Through hundreds of virtual experiments that play out overnight rather than across months of vulnerable human life. Yet for all the computational complexity and technical language, there is something disarmingly human at the core of this approach. Because it acknowledges that each body carries its own specific history, an internal architecture shaped by childhood illnesses, environmental exposures, genetic inheritance, and the quiet patterns of years of living. And it refuses to flatten that history into a general rule. Instead, the digital twin, in its fullest form, would sit at the intersection of your data streams, learning over time not only what is typical for a person of your age and background, but what is typical for you. Your usual blood pressure range, your personal rhythm of heart rate variability, your characteristic reaction to stress and rest. And it is that recognition of individuality that makes its predictions feel less like cold statistics and more like a companion's informed concern. Of course, the story of this technology is just beginning, and for now many of the most sophisticated twins exist in research labs or specialized hospitals. Their power directed at specific diseases or organs, but the trajectory is clear and quietly startling. As sensors become more seamless, as algorithms become more capable of integrating diverse kinds of data, as computational models are validated against the lived experiences of thousands of patients, the possibility of a holistic digital twin for the whole person moves from speculation toward design. In that future, awareness of your health would not arrive as a shock in the form of a diagnosis, but as a series of gentle warnings and opportunities. Moments when your virtual self, having run ahead into the space of possible futures, turns back to suggest a slight adjustment in diet, a more regular pattern of sleep. A conversation with a physician before a small anomaly becomes a looming threat, weaving prevention into daily life so seamlessly that it feels less like medical intervention and more like the natural care of tending to a garden before weeds take root. For now, though, it is enough to stand at this threshold and understand that the term digital twin is not an empty slogan or a distant dream, but a shorthand for an emerging convergence of technologies and insights that together seek to honor the complexity of the human organism without being overwhelmed by it. A way of bringing the quiet, often invisible workings of your body into a space where they can be seen, explored, and gently guided. So that over time, your virtual self may become not a curiosity, but a constant, quietly protective presence in the background of your life, watching, learning, and helping you stay well. To understand what it might really mean to build your virtual self, it helps to imagine the body not as a single, opaque object, but as a layered landscape of information, each layer capturing a different scale of reality, from the wild tumble of molecules in your cells to the measured cadence of your footsteps across a day. And then to see how these layers might, patiently and methodically, be brought together into one coherent living model that learns who you are over time. At the most intimate level lies your genome, the long stretch of DNA folded into the nuclei of your cells, bearing variations that shape your tendencies toward certain diseases, your responses to particular drugs, and your baseline physiology. Before we go further, if you enjoy slow, quiet explanations, subscribing makes it easier to find chill science next time. In the context of a medical digital twin, this information is not treated as a static label, but as a foundational set of parameters for simulations that will unfold over years, influencing how virtual heart tissue responds to stress, how modeled liver cells process medications, or how immune responses might flare under particular triggers. Around this genetic core, researchers now speak of multiomics, a term that gathers together epigenomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and microbiomics, each capturing a slightly different facet of the biochemical life of your body, from which genes are active in a given tissue, to which proteins are being produced, to which small molecules are circulating as fuels or signals, to the composition of the microbial ecosystems in your gut and on your skin. All of these woven into the digital twin as dynamic variables that can change with diet, environment, stress, and treatment. These molecular data, often obtained from blood draws, biopsies, and advanced sequencing technologies, are not simply stored in isolation. Within the twin, they become part of a network where a shift in one metabolite may suggest altered liver function, or a change in microbiome composition may be linked to inflammation or metabolic risk. The algorithms that govern the twin learn over time how these molecular ripples correspond to larger physiological waves in your particular case. On top of this molecular layer sits the more familiar realm of clinical data. Imaging studies, like MRI and CT scans that map the shapes and textures of your organs, ultrasound studies that trace the motion of valves and blood, echocardiograms and angiograms that show how fluid and pressure move through your cardiovascular system, pulmonary function tests that measure how air flows in and out of your lungs, and an array of lab results from cholesterol panels to hormone levels, each captured as structured data or as three-dimensional geometries that can be imported directly into biomechanical models. When engineers and clinicians collaborate on projects such as the living heart, these imaging-derived geometries become the scaffolding for finite element models, where the thickness of a ventricular wall, the curvature of a valve leaflet, and the branching pattern of coronary arteries are translated into meshes and boundary conditions. That can be used to simulate how an individual heart will contract, how electrical waves propagate, how a valve repair might alter flows, and how a device might either harmonize with or disrupt this delicate choreography. Surrounding these clinic-based snapshots and increasingly blending into them is the continuous stream of information from wearables and sensors, wrist-worn devices that track heart rate variability, sleep stages, and activity, patches and implanted monitors that record arrhythmias or blood pressure, smart rings and garments that measure temperature, respiration, and subtle movement, and emerging non-invasive sensors that can estimate glucose levels or other biochemical markers, all feeding the digital twin with a near real-time diary of how your body behaves in everyday life rather than just during rare visits to clinics. These wearable data hold particular value because they fill in the long, quiet intervals between tests, revealing patterns of stress and recovery, the impact of shift work or caregiving on sleep, the true variability of your resting heart rate across seasons or life events. And when this continuous record is aligned with the twins' internal models, it allows simulations to be corrected and recalibrated with each passing day, making predictions less like guesses and more like evolving weather forecasts specific to your physiology. Surrounding even these streams is the softer, but no less important, context of lifestyle and environment. What you eat and when, how often you move or remain still, your exposure to air pollutants, your consumption of tobacco or alcohol, your patterns of social engagement, and the habits that shape the rhythms of your nervous and endocrine systems. Information that is often recorded imperfectly, but which can increasingly be inferred in broad strokes from smartphone sensors, smart home devices, and voluntary self-reports, and which plays a crucial role in determining how your molecular and organ-level systems behave over time. In a developing medical digital twin, these lifestyle variables might not appear as detailed diaries, but as probabilistic factors that tilt simulations toward one trajectory or another, such as a higher modeled inflammatory burden in the presence of chronic sleep disruption, or altered metabolic parameters in the context of prolonged sedentary behavior. Allowing the twin to explore how even small, sustained changes in behavior might gently bend the curve of disease risk. Integrating these many layers is not a task that any single human mind can perform unaided, which is why artificial intelligence and machine learning sit at the center of digital twin architectures, not as mysterious oracles, but as tools for data fusion, pattern recognition, and prediction that can digest vast heterogeneous inputs, numbers, images, time series, and map them onto mechanistic models grounded in biology and physics. In practice, this often means combining mechanistic simulations, such as models of fluid dynamics in arteries or electrophysiology in heart tissue, with data-driven models trained on millions of historical patient records, so that the twin can leverage both the explanatory power of known physiological laws and the empirical knowledge embedded in population-level outcomes. A hybrid approach that allows it to both simulate inside your body and compare those simulations against what has actually happened to people like you. Machine learning helps estimate parameters that are hard to measure directly, such as tissue stiffness or microvascular resistance, by learning from patterns in imaging and sensor data. And it can also help identify subtle precursors to destabilization, like small changes in sleep-heart rate relationships that precede episodes of atrial fibrillation or heart failure exacerbations, triggers that the twin can recognize and flag long before standard clinical thresholds are crossed. What makes the digital twin different from a traditional risk calculator is this continuous cycle of observation, simulation, and adjustment. Data flows in from your genome, your labs, your wearables, your daily life. The twin uses mechanistic and statistical models to project forward, exploring many possible futures. And as new data arrive, those projections are compared with what actually happened, allowing the models to self-correct and become more attuned to your personal physiology over months and years. This sort of loop is visible already in organ-specific projects. In the Living Heart Initiative, for example, engineers refine heart models by comparing simulated contraction patterns against high-resolution imaging and device data from real patients, updating tissue properties and boundary conditions until the digital heart beats like its physical counterpart. And then using this tuned model to test hypotheticals such as different pacemaker lead placements or valve designs that would be impossible or unethical to try first in a human chest. In oncology, emerging digital twin frameworks use tumor genomics, radiologic images, and prior therapy responses to construct virtual tumors that can be subjected to different drug regimens in silico, predicting which combinations are most likely to shrink the cancer while preserving quality of life. And studies have begun to show how such virtual experimentation can support oncologists in choosing regimens that are better matched to the specific biology and resilience of the individual patient, rather than relying solely on protocol-driven sequences. These same principles are being extended to the scale of entire clinical trials, where virtual patients generated from digital twin frameworks can supplement or partially replace participants in control arms, allowing in silico trials to test dosing strategies, refine inclusion criteria, and anticipate safety issues before exposing large numbers of volunteers. A shift that could lower costs, reduce time, and minimize risk, especially in vulnerable populations like children. As the architecture of medical digital twins grows more sophisticated, there is a subtle but important shift in how one might think about medical records themselves. Instead of a static archive of past events, the record becomes a living, computational object, a model that continually consumes new information and updates its internal state. Meaning that your chart is no longer just a history, but a running simulation of your possible futures, waiting to be queried when decisions must be made. Seen this way, the act of building your virtual self is less like drawing a portrait and more like cultivating a garden of models and data streams that must be tended thoughtfully over time. With care taken to ensure that each new piece of information, each blood test, sensor reading, or imaging study, is placed in context, not merely stored but allowed to reshape the field of predictions in ways that are transparent to clinicians and comprehensible to patients. There is admittedly a quiet tension in this endeavor. The promise of greater precision depends on collecting and integrating more intimate data than ever before, and so the architecture must not only be technically elegant but also respectful, equipped with strong protections for privacy, clear rules about access and use, and mechanisms for patients to understand and influence how their digital twin learns and acts, for without this trust the model, however sophisticated, cannot fulfill its quiet protective role in daily life. But if those protections can be thoughtfully designed, the result is a kind of distributed, ever-listening companion that accompanies you through the changing seasons of your health, updating itself from inside your cells to the patterns of your days, and gradually becoming a wiser, more reliable guide. One that can catch a small deviation in your internal rhythms and whisper its suggestion for a gentler path long before you would otherwise have noticed that anything was amiss. To feel the real power of your digital twin, it helps to picture a quiet consultation that does not take place in a hospital room or over a desk, but inside a computer where your virtual body becomes a testing ground for choices that have not yet been made. So that when you and your clinicians finally do decide on a path, it is one that has already been rehearsed many times in a safe, mathematical rehearsal space that carries none of the risks of experimenting directly on flesh and blood. In cardiovascular care, this rehearsal is no longer a distant promise but an evolving practice. If you made it to the finish, I really appreciate you. If you want more slow, soothing science, liking the video and subscribing keeps the next one easy to find. Within the Living Heart Project and similar initiatives, a detailed three-dimensional model of an individual's heart can be generated from imaging and clinical data, then tuned until its virtual contractions, valve motions, and pressure curves match the patient's own. After which cardiologists and engineers can explore what-if scenarios that would be impractical or dangerous to try in vivo, such as placing a device at slightly different angles, tightening or loosening a virtual repair, or pacing the heart with alternative timing, all while watching how blood flow patterns, wall stress, and electrical activation respond. This ability to experiment in silico means that each intervention can be refined before the first incision or catheter insertion, with the twin revealing combinations that provide adequate benefit with fewer side effects. Whether that means reducing the risk of arrhythmia, minimizing the chance of damaging a delicate structure, or preserving more native function than a generic one-size-fits-all approach would have allowed. Beyond the heart, similar ideas are being pressed into service for vascular stents, prosthetic valves, and novel devices, with regulatory agencies beginning to consider virtual simulations as digital evidence that can supplement animal studies and early-phase trials. Allowing rare but critical failure modes to be explored across many virtual patients before a device ever reaches a large population. This same philosophy of rehearsing care on a virtual self is particularly compelling in oncology, where treatments can be both life-saving and harsh, and where the difference between two plausible drug combinations may be measured in months of added survival intertwined with very different burdens of toxicity. Here, researchers build tumor-specific twins by combining a person's genomic and transcriptomic data with imaging that maps tumor size, shape, and surrounding tissue, then link these to models of cell growth, drug diffusion, and immune response. In such a twin, hypothetical regimens can be applied digitally, varying doses, schedules, and sequences of chemotherapy, targeted drugs, and immunotherapies. While the model tracks how the virtual tumor shrinks or adapts, how simulated blood counts fall and rise, how markers of liver and kidney stress behave, and whether the immune system is likely to be invigorated or exhausted. Giving the clinician a ranked set of strategies that are tailored not only to the cancer's biology, but also to the patient's overall resilience. In early studies, these virtual experiments have shown that even among patients with similar diagnoses, the predicted optimal sequences can differ markedly, reflecting the subtle but important ways that tumor mutations, microenvironment, and host factors interact. And this is precisely where digital twins promise to transform cancer care from protocol-based to person-based, replacing a rigid ladder of standard lines with a more fluid, individualized choreography. At a broader scale, digital twin frameworks are being woven into the concept of in silico clinical trials, where virtual patients derived from real-world data, sometimes starting from detailed organ-specific models like the living heart, and sometimes from statistical twins calibrated to observed outcomes, are used to explore how a new therapy might behave across a large, diverse population before exposing thousands of real people to it. In these virtual trials, a drug's pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics are simulated within each twin, and different inclusion criteria, dosing regimens, and combination strategies can be tested to see how they influence efficacy and safety metrics, allowing researchers to identify designs that are more likely to succeed and to foresee where rare but serious adverse events might cluster, even if such events cannot be predicted perfectly given the complexity of human biology. There is particular interest in using digital twins to support pediatric research, where ethical constraints and small patient numbers make traditional trials difficult. Here, synthetic cohorts generated from calibrated twins may serve as partial control arms, reducing the number of children who must be assigned to placebo or suboptimal therapies, while still providing robust comparative data for regulators and clinicians. These approaches do not eliminate the need for physical trials, nor can they fully anticipate novel toxicities, but they can act as a powerful filter, discarding weak or unsafe candidates early, sharpening the focus of later-phase studies, and illuminating subgroups that might benefit or be harmed in ways that would otherwise remain obscure until after wide deployment. As digital twin medicine matures, it also begins to touch the everyday experience of individual patients beyond the clinic and trial setting, turning long arcs of disease into conversations that can unfold with more nuance than a simple schedule of appointments allows. For example, consider a person with heart failure or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease whose wearable devices, home spirometry, and occasional lab tests feed into a twin that continually models fluid balance, respiratory reserve, and cardiac workload, generating forecasts of destabilization days or even weeks in advance. Instead of waiting for shortness of breath and swelling to push them toward an emergency room, the combination of their twins' predictions and their clinician's judgment might lead to small, timely adjustments in medication, gentle reminders to moderate salt intake, or suggestions to schedule an earlier checkup. Shifting care from crisis response to quiet, anticipatory guidance that fits more easily into daily life. In metabolic disease, a twin that integrates glucose monitoring, meal timing, sleep, activity, and medication could simulate how different ways of eating or dosing would alter blood sugar excursions over the coming days. Allowing a person with diabetes not just to react to high readings, but to explore in advance which choices will lead to smoother patterns with fewer damaging spikes and crashes, thereby lightening the cognitive load and emotional strain of constant self-management. Even mental health, often thought of as too delicate or subjective for such modeling, may benefit from gentler forms of twin-based forecasting, where patterns of sleep, activity, social contact, and self-reported mood are used to detect early shifts toward depression, mania, or relapse. Prompting offers of support, adjustments in therapy, or changes in daily routine before a full crisis emerges, though such applications will require especially careful design to avoid becoming intrusive or paternalistic. All of this experimentation with your virtual self hinges on a delicate balance between trust and skepticism, between honoring the twin's guidance and respecting the irreducible complexity of living bodies. Clinicians and regulators are keenly aware that models can be wrong, that rare interactions and unknown mechanisms can elude even the most sophisticated simulations, and so there is a parallel movement to develop rigorous standards for validating digital twins, specifying for which questions they are reliable and where they should be treated only as suggestive. This validation involves not only comparing simulated outcomes with retrospective patient data, but also embedding prospective tests, using the twin to predict near-term responses, and then checking those predictions against what actually happens. In a continuous learning loop that gradually maps the boundaries of the model's competence and adjusts it as new therapies, devices, and patterns of disease emerge. In this sense, the digital twin is not a final authority, but a constantly improving collaborator, one whose recommendations must be interpreted in light of clinical experience, patient values, and the humility that comes from recognizing how much about the human body remains only partially understood. And it is in this collaboration that the technology finds its most human expression, not in replacing judgment, but in widening the horizon of what can be seen and gently tested before choice solidifies into action. For the individual standing at the edge of a major treatment decision, the knowledge that their virtual self has already tried out many possible paths, that a surgeon has rehearsed their operation in a faithful digital replica of their anatomy, that an oncologist has watched a simulated version of their tumor respond to multiple regimens, that a new drug has been run through thousands of virtual patients whose biology resembles their own, can offer a quiet reassurance that the choice ahead is not a leap into the dark, but a step taken with the accumulated insight of many invisible prior journeys. And as these capabilities gradually spread, moving from specialized research centers into ordinary hospitals, then into the software woven through primary care clinics and even home health ecosystems, the idea of your digital twin will become less an exotic piece of jargon and more a familiar, if still awe-inspiring, presence, a companion that has already seen many possible versions of your tomorrow and is always patiently trying to guide you toward the ones in which you have more room to breathe, to move, and to live well. When the idea of a digital twin lifts its gaze from the scale of single organs and individual treatment choices to the wider patterns of cities, nations, and ecosystems of care, it begins to resemble a kind of quiet, computational weather system for health. One that can watch how diseases move, how vaccines travel, how people's behaviors and vulnerabilities intersect across space and time, and then explore, gently but rigorously, how different public health decisions might alter those patterns before they touch real bodies and communities. In this broader view, the twin is no longer just a mirror of one person's physiology, but a layered model of health services, infrastructures, and populations. Able to ask questions such as what happens to immunization coverage when a cold chain falters in a particular region, how quickly an outbreak might grow under different levels of mobility and masking, or which neighborhoods are at risk of being left behind, if new vaccines are rolled out without special attention to access and trust. Projects like TwinVax sketch the outline of such systems, proposing digital twins for immunization services in primary care that monitor storage temperatures, stock levels, appointment flows, and historical coverage. And then use this integrated view to predict where vaccine spoilage is likely, where gaps in protection are widening, and how targeted campaigns could restore the delicate fabric of herd immunity with fewer resources and less waste. These architectures treat health services themselves as living entities that can be simulated. Refrigerators and transport trucks become nodes whose temperature histories can be tracked and stress-tested. Clinics are modeled as queues of patients and staff, and populations appear as distributions of age, risk, and prior infection, so that subtle bottlenecks and fragilities that are invisible on spreadsheets become visible when the twin runs through many possible weeks and months of operations. At the scale of epidemics and pandemics, digital twin approaches draw on mobility data, contact patterns, viral characteristics, and public health interventions to create virtual worlds that play out how a pathogen spreads across networks of households, workplaces, and transit routes. Allowing researchers and decision-makers to test what-if scenarios, more aggressive testing in one region, earlier mask recommendations, localized school closures, different vaccination prioritizations, without waiting for those policies to unfold in the real world, where missteps cost lives and livelihoods. These models, some of which have been used to inform COVID-19 responses, show that even modest adjustments in timing or targeting can produce large differences in outcomes when cascaded through the complex dynamics of transmission and human behavior. And they underscore why having a continuously updated twin of the epidemic, fed with real-time data on cases, variants, and mobility, can be so valuable for guiding responses that are both proportionate and adaptive rather than blunt and delayed. As such population-level twins grow more refined, they begin to intersect with the more intimate digital twins of individuals, suggesting futures in which personal risk scores and community forecasts interact. Your virtual self, aware of your health history and vulnerabilities, might receive gently tailored advice based not only on your internal physiology, but also on how infection is unfolding in the neighborhoods you move through. While public health planners, seeing anonymized patterns of many twins, could design interventions that are more precise and less disruptive, focusing protection where it is needed most. In parallel with these technical advances, however, an equally intricate conversation is unfolding about ethics, rights, and responsibilities, because the same qualities that make medical digital twins powerful, their intimacy, their comprehensiveness, their predictive capacity, also make them a source of new kinds of risk if not carefully governed. The ethical questions begin at the level of privacy and data protection. A digital twin is not just another medical record, but a densely interwoven model that may contain genomic sequences, detailed health histories, behavioral patterns, and real-time sensor data. All combined into a representation that could, in the wrong hands, reveal not only who you are today but plausible futures of your health, including risks for conditions that have not yet manifested. This depth of information makes twins an attractive target for cyber attacks and misuse, raising concerns about identity theft, genetic discrimination, the use of predictive health profiles in employment and insurance, and the possibility that a person might be judged not only by their past, but by simulations of their possible future illnesses or limitations. Ethical analyses and early policy discussions emphasize that protecting digital twins will require security measures and regulatory frameworks that go beyond those used for ordinary electronic health records. Incorporating strong encryption, careful access controls, rigorous audit trails, and clear legal prohibitions on secondary uses that patients have not explicitly authorized, particularly in contexts like advertising, credit scoring, or non-medical surveillance. Consent, too, becomes more complex in a world of twins because the model is not static. It grows and changes as new data streams in, and it may be used in novel ways over time as algorithms evolve. leading ethicists to argue that consent for digital twins cannot be a one-time checkbox but must be ongoing, specific, and revisitable, with transparent explanations of what the twin currently does, who can use it, and how its insights might affect decisions about care, research, and access to services. There's also the thorny question of ownership and control. Patients are the source of the data, healthcare providers manage much of the clinical context, and technology companies often build and maintain the platforms and algorithms, leaving an ambiguous landscape in which it is not always clear who owns the resulting twin and who has the right to profit from it or to decide how its capabilities are extended. Many bioethicists and patient advocates argue that, at a minimum, patients should retain meaningful rights to access their twins, to understand their main features, to consent or refuse secondary uses such as research or commercial analytics, and to withdraw their data from certain contexts where the balance of benefit and risk no longer feels acceptable, while also recognizing that some degree of data sharing is essential for improving models and realizing the social value of this technology. Interwoven with these concerns is the problem of bias and equity. Because digital twins are trained and calibrated using existing data, they inevitably reflect the structures of the health systems and societies that produce that data, including long-standing inequities in who is diagnosed, who receives high-quality care, whose symptoms are taken seriously, and whose neighborhoods are overburdened by pollution or underserved by clinics. If left unexamined, these biases could lead to twins that perform better for some groups than others, systematically underestimating risks for populations that have historically been underrepresented in research, or over-policing and over-predicting adverse outcomes in groups that have been subjected to structural discrimination, thereby compounding injustice rather than relieving it. Addressing this requires deliberate effort, assembling diverse data sets, auditing models for performance across demographic and socioeconomic strata, including patients and communities in the design of twin-based services, and building in mechanisms for recourse when individuals suspect that a twin's prediction has been unfairly shaped by biased inputs rather than by their true biology and lived experience. Then there is the question of access, which sits quietly but insistently in the background. The infrastructure needed to create and maintain rich digital twins, genomic sequencing, high-resolution imaging, continuous wearable monitoring, high-performance computing, remains concentrated in wealthier health systems and urban centers, raising the risk that twin-based medicine could become a new frontier of disparity. Offering its most sophisticated predictive and preventive benefits to those who are already better resourced, while leaving marginalized communities with older, more reactive forms of care. To prevent digital twins from deepening existing divides, global health scholars and clinicians stress the importance of designing models that can also work with lower-intensity data, integrating signals from basic clinical measures and simple sensors, and of pairing technological innovation with policies aimed at expanding access to core health services, digital connectivity, and literacy, so that the benefits of personalized forecasting and early intervention are not restricted to a privileged few. Against this rich and sometimes unsettling backdrop, visions of the future of personalized health with digital twins become both more grounded and more nuanced. The most thoughtful accounts do not promise a frictionless, perfectly optimized existence, but rather a gradual, negotiated partnership between humans, institutions, and algorithms, in which the twin acts as an additional sense, a way of perceiving trajectories and connections that would otherwise remain invisible, while people retain the agency to interpret and respond to those perceptions in light of their own values and circumstances. In that imagined future, many individuals might live alongside a continuously updated digital twin that quietly monitors their physiology and daily patterns, sending only occasional, context-aware suggestions. A nudge to schedule a checkup because subtle heart rhythm changes have been accumulating, a gentle warning that sleep and mood trends suggest a depressive episode may be approaching. A personalized recommendation for nutrition or exercise that takes into account not abstract guidelines, but the specific quirks of their metabolism and schedule. Over the course of decades, such guidance could help extend not just lifespan, but health span, the number of years lived with good function and vitality. Turning the twin into a kind of guardian that is less concerned with chasing disease at the brink of catastrophe and more attuned to the slow work of keeping systems resilient, much as a gardener pays attention to soil, light, and water long before plants show obvious distress. At the same time, the presence of these twins at scale could enrich medical knowledge, as anonymized, consented aggregates of twin data reveal new patterns of risk, new early biomarkers of disease, and new windows of opportunity for intervention. That can then be translated into better care for those who choose not to or cannot engage fully with twin-based systems, ensuring that the wisdom gleaned from virtual selves returns to the broader human community. There will likely always be limits to what can be predicted, always moments when biology surprises even the best models, and so the most mature vision of digital twin medicine is not one of seamless control, but of deepened dialogue, where patients, clinicians, and their virtual counterparts share a growing understanding of the body's tendencies and possibilities and use, that understanding to navigate uncertainty with a bit more foresight, compassion, and calm. In this sense, the promise that your virtual self could help save your life is not just about dramatic interventions, catching an arrhythmia before it becomes lethal, spotting a tumor's resistance pattern before it spreads, but also about the quieter, cumulative work of staying well, of noticing when your internal weather is beginning to turn, of choosing a gentler path while change is still easy, and of carrying through the years a sense that your body's story is being listened to carefully, in both its visible episodes and its inaudible undercurrents, by a companion made of numbers, models, and care. To picture the future of personalized health in the age of digital twins, imagine that the scattered fragments of monitoring that mark care today, the occasional checkup, the episodic blood test, the hurried visit when something feels wrong, have been replaced by a steadier, subtler kind of attention. One that follows you through the long arc of your life like a careful listener, translating the fluctuations of your biology and behavior into a continuously evolving sense of where you are headed and how gently your trajectory might be nudged toward better paths. In this quieter future, your digital twin is not a spectacle but an unobtrusive companion residing in secure servers, regularly updated by data from wearables, home sensors, clinical measurements, and perhaps even periodic multi-omics profiling, weaving these streams into a living model that can forecast not only the course of a single disease, but the broader pattern of how different systems, cardiovascular, metabolic, musculoskeletal, cognitive, interact as you age. Such a twin would not bombard you with alerts. Instead, it would learn to recognize what is typical for you and reserve its voice for moments when your internal rhythms begin to drift meaningfully away from those baselines. Perhaps noting that your recovery after exertion has been slowing over many months, that your sleep and heart rate patterns are gradually aligning with profiles associated with future metabolic disease, or that early changes in gait and reaction time resemble trajectories that in others have preceded falls or cognitive decline. In research proposals such as Lifetime, where life course digital twins are envisioned, the idea is to begin this kind of intelligent monitoring early, linking childhood histories and developmental milestones to adult patterns, and using that longitudinal view to identify individuals who are quietly accumulating risks for clusters of conditions, cardiometabolic diseases, mental health challenges, frailty, long before clinical thresholds are crossed, thereby opening wider windows for preventive interventions that are more modest, humane, and effective than the heroic efforts required once multimorbidity is established. Over time, the twins' forecasts would become part of the background texture of care, informing not only medication choices, but the subtler arts of lifestyle and environment design. Clinicians might use its simulations to show you how slightly different trajectories of physical activity, diet, or sleep, sustained over years, ripple through your projected health, revealing that small but consistent changes made now can carry more weight than drastic measures taken later in crisis. In the realm of aging and longevity, emerging work on biological age measures suggests that digital twins could incorporate aging clocks as quantitative anchors, using biomarkers to estimate how quickly your body is aging relative to the calendar, and updating this estimate as you live so that the twin can detect early signs of accelerated aging and help design interventions, nutritional strategies, exercise regimens, stress reduction, perhaps targeted therapies that aim not at indefinite life but at a longer span of years lived with clarity, strength, and independence. Health systems seen through this lens also acquire twins of their own, as reviews of healthcare digital twins describe. Hospitals and clinics monitored by models that simulate patient flows, resource use, and staff workloads, enabling administrators to anticipate bottlenecks, prevent dangerous overcrowding, and ensure that when your twin signals a need for a timely test or consultation, the physical system is ready to respond without excessive delay or fragmentation. The same infrastructures that support individual twins, standardized data formats, interoperable electronic records, robust networks, would allow this multi-layered ecosystem to function. Linking personal forecasts with public capacities so that personalized recommendations are realistic, grounded in what the system can deliver, and used to guide investments in staffing, equipment, and community outreach where they will quietly prevent the greatest harm. As these possibilities become clearer, professional bodies and policymakers are beginning to sketch out consensus views on how digital twins should be used and governed, recognizing that the technology's promise will only be realized if patients trust it and if clinicians can rely on it without being overwhelmed. Recent consensus statements emphasize that twins should support, not replace, human decision-making across prevention, diagnosis, prognosis, and therapy, and that their operation must be transparent enough for both providers and patient consumers to understand in broad terms what the models are doing and where their limitations lie. Meta-reviews surveying dozens of pilot projects and early deployments find that twins can enhance precision, enable earlier interventions, and streamline operations. But they also repeatedly point to technical, ethical, and financial barriers, data quality gaps, fragmented systems that cannot yet share information smoothly, concerns about privacy and surveillance, shortages of expertise, and the risk that poorly implemented twin systems might add to clinician burden rather than easing it. The path forward they sketch is not one of rapid, frictionless adoption, but of careful, staged integration, building standards for data and model validation, creating multidisciplinary teams that include engineers, clinicians, ethicists, and patients, investing in secure, interoperable infrastructures, and designing user interfaces that translate complex simulations into calm, meaningful narratives rather than overwhelming dashboards. In parallel, global perspectives are emerging that ask not only how digital twins can refine care in well-resourced settings, but how they might be adapted to support health in regions where resources are constrained and burdens of disease are high, as analyses focused on Africa and other underserved contexts suggest. Here, twins might initially rely on simpler data sources, basic clinical measures, community-level indicators, minimal wearables, and focus on optimizing the use of scarce equipment, predicting vaccine needs, or guiding outreach for chronic disease management, with the long-term goal of building capacity so that more sophisticated, individualized twins become possible over time. It is within this blended landscape of personal and systemic change that the image of a continuously updated digital twin acting as a health guardian becomes most vivid. Not as an all-knowing oracle, but as an additional layer of awareness that gently thickens the texture of care, turning invisible trends into visible possibilities, and and helping people navigate the long, unpredictable journey of their lives with a bit more foresight and fewer sudden shocks. Walking through an ordinary year in such a future, you might encounter your twin only intermittently. A message before a routine visit noting that your cardiovascular risk profile has shifted slightly and suggesting a discussion about a new medication or lifestyle adjustment. A quiet prompt in your health app explaining that your recent pattern of late nights and skipped meals is nudging several of your internal metrics in an unfavorable direction, accompanied by modest, concrete options to restore balance that fit your preferences rather than imposing rigid prescriptions. At other times, the twin may act more in the background, adjusting its internal parameters in response to a bout of illness or a new exercise habit, recalibrating your projected trajectories without fanfare. So that when a decision point arises, whether to start a preventive therapy, whether to undergo a screening test earlier than standard guidelines recommend, your clinician can show you not generic curves, but visualizations of how different choices would likely shape your own path over the coming years. For some, especially those living with complex chronic conditions or recovering from major events like heart attacks or cancer, the relationship with the twin may be more active, as it helps fine-tune medication doses, predicts risks of relapse or complications, and co-evolves with rehabilitation plans, allowing adjustments that balance effectiveness, side effects, and daily life in ways that feel more humane than the coarse trial-and-error approaches of the past. For others, particularly the young and currently well, the twin may serve primarily as an early warning system and a subtle educator. Glimpsed mostly through periodic summaries that gently translate what it has learned about their biology and context into suggestions for maintaining resilience. So that the concept of prevention moves from an abstract admonition to an ongoing collaboration between person, clinician, and model. Throughout all of this, there remains the irreducible fact that no model can fully capture the richness and unpredictability of a single human life. Accidents, sudden infections, shifts in social circumstances, and the complex textures of emotion and meaning will always escape neat simulation. And so the mature vision of digital twin medicine intentionally leaves room for uncertainty, intuition, and choice, treating the twin not as a script, but as a set of well-informed, ever-evolving suggestions offered in a spirit of partnership. The heart of the matter, then, is less that your virtual self will save your life in any dramatic, singular moment, and more that by walking quietly alongside you, learning your patterns, and sharing its foresight at opportune times, it may help you and those who care for you to avoid some dangers, soften others, and cultivate a life in which health is less a fragile possession and more a garden tended with informed patience, season after season, in the company of a mirror that sees farther than you could see alone. As the notion of a digital twin settles into the fabric of medicine, there is a quieter, more intimate transformation unfolding alongside the technical one. A shift in how people may come to experience their own bodies and their relationships with those who care for them when a virtual counterpart is always present, humming softly in the background as a kind of second medical gaze that is at once reassuring and uncanny. For clinicians, the twin appears as an expanded field of view, a dynamic canvas where disease trajectories, treatment options, and system-level consequences can be explored in advance. Before we move on, a quick subscribe helps this stay in your feed whenever you're ready to relax and learn again. Turning what used to be a largely intuitive weighing of probabilities into something more explicitly shared. A joint examination of simulated futures that can be discussed, questioned, and adapted in conversation with the patient sitting in front of them. Narrative reviews emphasize that this modeling does not have to distance doctors from patients. Instead, when used thoughtfully, it can deepen the encounter by giving both parties a clearer, visual language for talking about uncertainty and trade-offs. Making it possible to say not simply, "This might help, but here is how your virtual self responds in different scenarios," and here is where the model is confident and where it grows hazy, thereby inviting questions, emotions, and preferences into the heart of decision-making. The digital transformation of medicine has already raised concerns that screens and electronic records can pull clinicians' attention away from the person in the room. But the more hopeful vision of digital twins treats them as tools for recentering that encounter, with interfaces designed not as cluttered dashboards, but as calm, comprehensible storyboards that can be turned toward the patient and used as shared maps rather than private instruments of control. In this setting, access to one's own twin becomes more than a technical feature. It becomes part of how patients craft their identities as active participants in their care, much as earlier generations learned to read their own lab reports or to interpret the trends in their home blood pressure. But now with models that integrate far more information, and that must therefore be handled with particular care to avoid overwhelming or alienating the people they are meant to empower. Studies of digital identity in health professionals hint at the complexity of living with a digital reflection. When online personas and real-world roles diverge, people experience discomfort and a sense of misalignment, and similar tensions could arise if someone's medical twin, built from data and algorithms, begins to portray them in ways that do not match their felt experience of health and illness. Perhaps labeling them high risk when they feel well, or suggesting futures they find difficult to recognize as their own. The philosophical and sociological literature on the quantified self suggests that data-intensive monitoring can produce both empowerment and pressure, offering new insights into habits and patterns while also inviting people to feel responsible for optimizing every measurable parameter. And a medical digital twin, as a particularly sophisticated form of such monitoring, will need to be framed not as a scorecard for self-perfection, but as a gentle, fallible companion that offers information without judgment. Done well, this could support a more nuanced form of shared decision-making, where patients bring their values, fears, and hopes, clinicians bring their experience and interpretive skills, and the twin contributes its simulations, each acknowledging the other's limits. The model cannot feel what it is like to live with fatigue. The clinician cannot run 1,000 hypothetical trials overnight, and the patient cannot see microscopic processes unfolding in their tissues. But together they can form a more complete picture of what different choices might mean in a life that is always larger than its measurements. This triad, patient, clinician, twin, also raises new questions about responsibility and trust. When an adverse outcome occurs despite favorable simulations, will people blame the model, the clinician who relied on it, or themselves for agreeing to the plan? And how can systems be designed so that such moments become opportunities for learning and calibration, rather than for erosion of confidence or the simplistic attribution of fault to whichever party is easiest to accuse? Narratives from critical care and acute medicine, where decisions are time-pressured and stakes are high, underline the need for clear boundaries about when twin-based recommendations should guide action and when they should be treated as advisory. Particularly in contexts where data are sparse or rapidly changing, so that clinicians maintain the freedom to depart from model outputs when their judgment or the patient's wishes point in a different direction. Beyond the clinic, there are more diffuse, existential questions about what it means to have a virtual self circulating in health systems and perhaps in research networks. Some people may find comfort in the idea that part of them continues to contribute to science, even after death, as their twin is used to explore therapies or understand disease. While others may feel unease at the notion of their biology and behavior being abstracted into a model that persists beyond their control, raising calls for clear policies about how and when twins are retired, archived, or repurposed. Ethical analyses increasingly argue that respect for persons in the era of digital twins must extend beyond consent forms to include ongoing dialogue about these existential dimensions. Acknowledging that for some, the twin will be experienced not simply as a tool, but as a kind of second self, one that may influence how they think about aging, risk, and the narrative of their own life course. That second self, precisely because it is predictive, can bend the line between knowing and becoming. Hearing that one's digital twin forecasts a high likelihood of a certain illness may motivate constructive change, but it may also shape expectations and anxieties in ways that subtly influence behavior and well-being. A phenomenon that psychologists recognize in contexts like genetic risk disclosure, and that is likely to reappear here unless predictions are carefully framed and accompanied by support. To navigate this, some scholars suggest drawing on the language of scenarios and possibilities rather than fixed destinies. Presenting the twins' output as a set of branching paths that remain sensitive to ongoing choices and changes rather than as a single, inevitable trajectory, thereby preserving a sense of agency and openness even in the face of quantified forecasts. Meanwhile, efforts to co-create equitable digital patient twins, particularly with women and historically marginalized groups, highlight the importance of ensuring that these models do not simply reflect and amplify existing power imbalances, but instead become sites where different experiences and priorities can shape the technology itself, from which outcomes are considered most important to how uncertainty and risk are communicated. This co-creation extends to design details that might seem small but carry real weight. Whether the twins' interface uses language that is technical or conversational, whether it focuses on deficits or strengths, whether it allows people to hide or emphasize certain aspects of their lives, and whether it offers space for them to annotate and interpret their own data, weaving their story back into the model in ways that resist a purely clinical gaze. At the same time, broader critiques of AI in health caution that any system with the power to profile, predict, and influence behavior must be scrutinized for its potential to be used in coercive or commercial ways, nudging people toward products or policies that serve institutions more than individuals. And so the governance of medical digital twins will need to be anchored not only in technical standards, but in robust, democratically informed discussions about acceptable uses and red lines. All of this suggests that the arrival of your virtual self in medicine is not merely a story of improved diagnostics and personalized therapies, but also a cultural and ethical moment. One in which societies decide how comfortable they are with being mirrored so precisely, how much predictive knowledge they wish to carry, and how they will protect the vulnerable when models are wrong or misused. Yet within this complexity, it remains possible to hold onto a simple, calm aspiration. That digital twins, shaped by careful design and thoughtful oversight, can help restore something medicine has always sought but often struggled to achieve, a way of seeing each person as both unique and connected, as a singular body and story that deserves tailored care, and as part of larger patterns from which shared understanding and collective protection can arise. In that sense, your virtual self may become less a strange technological artifact and more a quiet extension of an ancient practice. The attempt to listen more closely to the body, to notice early when its balance is beginning to tilt, and to respond with respect, compassion, and patience, using all the tools available, including now these intricate, evolving models, to accompany you as you move through time. Never erasing uncertainty, but offering a clearer view of the paths ahead and a steadier hand as you choose your way among them. Standing at the edge of this emerging landscape, where virtual bodies evolve alongside living ones in medicine, gradually reorients itself from reacting to crises toward listening for faint future echoes, it becomes easier to see digital twin medicine not as a discrete invention, but as a long, unfolding conversation between many disciplines, each contributing a piece of the puzzle of how to care for complex, aging, interconnected lives. Comprehensive reviews now describe how, in only a few years, healthcare digital twins have moved from speculative diagrams to practical tools that reduce arrhythmia recurrence, refine neurodegenerative disease prediction, and deliver highly accurate organ-level simulations, while still emphasizing that these successes are early sparks within a field that must yet solve deeper challenges of data integration, validation, and governance before it can truly become part of everyday care for all. Scoping reviews of human digital twins in health paint a multidimensional picture. The most mature applications cluster around personalized medicine, operational efficiency, and research, but there is also a steady expansion toward mental health, rehabilitation, and community-level modeling, suggesting that the technology's trajectory is one of gradual widening, from specialized organs to whole persons, from individuals to systems, and from controlled environments to the unpredictability of real-world living. If you're still here at the end, thank you. If this helped you relax and learn, tapping like and subscribing is the simplest way to support more episodes like this. Editorials that gather contributions from engineers, clinicians, ethicists, and designers describe this moment as a threshold, a transition from the digital twin as a vague buzzword to a concrete tool that must prove itself in the messy, time-pressed, resource-constrained reality of clinics and hospitals. And they call for research that moves beyond idealized prototypes toward robust, maintainable implementations that can survive software updates, staff turnover, and shifting regulatory landscapes. What emerges from these assessments is a sense of both urgency and patience. Urgency, because every year of delay is another year in which preventable complications, missed early warnings, and inefficient trials take their toll on people and systems. Patience, because each step forward demands careful attention to unintended consequences, to the unevenness of infrastructure, and to the human relationships that make technology meaningful or alienating. Socio-ethical analyses, drawing on interviews with stakeholders across industry, policy, research, and civil society, remind us that digital twins carry the potential to produce not only clinical benefits but also social value by supporting prevention, reducing costs, enhancing autonomy, and promoting more equal treatment, even as they also pose risks of privacy erosion, new forms of data property disputes, and the disruption of existing structures in ways that could widen inequalities if left unchecked. The balance between these benefits and risks will not be determined by algorithms alone, but by choices that societies make about regulation, reimbursement, public infrastructure, and the norms of professional practice. Whether payers incentivize long-term preventive gains as strongly as short-term procedures, whether regulators demand explainability and equity audits as conditions of approval, whether training programs teach future clinicians to see the twin as a partner rather than a competitor, and whether patients are invited into genuine co-design rather than merely being asked to consent at the end. Design researchers looking at digital twin technology through the lens of human factors and participatory innovation argue that the shape of this future is still malleable. Interfaces can be crafted to calm rather than alarm. Default settings can be chosen to favor privacy and informed choice. And workflows can be reconfigured so that twin-derived insights appear at moments when they enhance understanding, instead of appearing as a stream of decontextualized alerts that contribute to burnout and distrust. National and regional initiatives, from policy projects exploring foundational research gaps to health system pilots that integrate twins into critical care decision support, demonstrate that when governance structures, technical infrastructure, and clinical champions align, digital twins can move from isolated experiments to shared platforms that serve many programs and specialties while maintaining strong protections and clear accountability. At the same time, these efforts underscore that there will be no single universal twin. Rather, there will be families of models, some deeply mechanistic, others more statistical, some focused on organs, others on workflows or communities, linked together through interoperable standards and common ethical frameworks so that insights can travel across scales without forcing everything into one rigid architecture. For individuals, that pluralism may never be visible. What they will experience, if this vision is realized with care, is simply a sense that medicine has become more anticipatory and more personal, that their history seems to be remembered and understood in richer ways, that their choices are contextualized not only by population averages, but by an evolving understanding of their own trajectory, and that clinicians arrive at conversations armed with a quieter confidence, that the options they present have been tested in a space that resembles the patient's reality more closely than generic guidelines alone can manage. There will be moments when the twins' presence is sharply felt, a predicted crisis averted, a therapy chosen that spares unnecessary harm, a trial designed that reaches its answer faster and more safely, and long stretches when it fades into the background, its simulations running silently as part of the unseen scaffolding that supports a smoother, more responsive system. In these ways, digital twin medicine invites a reimagining of care that is less about heroics at the brink of catastrophe and more about the continuous tending of the possible, the sustained cultivation of conditions in which bodies can adapt, recover, and age with fewer sudden breaks in the narrative of daily life, supported by models that neither dominate nor disappear but accompany. None of this cancels the fundamental uncertainties that have always haunted medicine. There will still be unexpected illnesses, sudden losses, conditions that elude prediction and resist control. And so one of the deeper tasks ahead is to integrate digital twins into a culture of care that acknowledges limits with humility, using prediction not to promise invincibility, but to enlarge the space in which compassion and wise choice can operate. In that sense, the story of your virtual self is ultimately bound to older stories about how societies choose to care for one another, how they distribute attention and resources, how they value prevention relative to cure, and how they negotiate the tension between individual agency and collective responsibility. Digital twins, for all their sophistication, are tools that will merely reflect and perhaps amplify those underlying commitments. If in the years ahead, healthcare systems embrace this technology with a clear eye, investing in infrastructure and equity, insisting on transparency and patient voice, accepting that some promises will outpace reality for a time while still nurturing the long-term project, then digital twin medicine may become one of the quiet revolutions of the century, altering not the drama of the human condition but the textures of everyday health, the shape of risk, and the gentle arcs by which lives unfold. And in that quieter revolution, your virtual self will not be an exotic artifact or a distant sci-fi echo, but simply another part of how your body is known and cared for. A detailed, ever-learning reflection that stands beside you and your clinicians as you move through time, helping you see more clearly, choose more wisely, and inhabit your own biology with a little less fear and a little more understanding as science, computation, and human concern continue their slow, intricate work of learning how to keep one another alive and well.